tension between the tension between collective identity and individual autonomy, specifically, the feeling that the social definition of acceptable blackness has become narrower in certain spaces, while the lived reality of black people has always been far more ideologically and culturally diverse. There's a contradiction in how the black community often talks about unity versus how individuality is actually treated in practice. Public discourse frequently emphasizes collective struggle, collective responsibility, and shared political or cultural alignment, but many black individuals experience the community as increasingly conditional rather than universally embracing. For many black men, especially, acceptance can appear tied not only to racial identity but also to ideological conformity. Certain positions or lifestyles, capitalism, landlordism, gun rights advocacy, political independence, interracial dating, or even simply refusing to subscribe to dominant narratives, can lead to accusations of betrayal, cooning, self-hatred, or abandonment of the community. This creates a paradox. People are encouraged to remain connected to the collective, yet are often socially penalized for expressing individuality that falls outside unofficial cultural expectations. As a result, some black individuals disengage from communal spaces altogether, not necessarily because they reject blackness, but because they no longer feel psychologically or intellectually welcomed within those spaces. The deeper issue may not be disagreement itself, but the shrinking tolerance for ideological diversity within intra-community discourse. A healthy collective identity can usually withstand internal differences. But when belonging starts to feel conditional upon political, cultural, or social alignment, fragmentation becomes more likely. In that environment, individualism becomes less an act of selfishness and more an act of self-preservation. People retreat into smaller circles where they feel understood rather than constantly evaluated against shifting standards of authenticity or loyalty. There are also a few layered dynamics underneath my observation. Historical pressure toward solidarity. Black communities historically relied on collective survival under segregation, exclusion, and systemic discrimination. That produced strong norms around racial loyalty and group cohesion. The downside is that dissent can sometimes be interpreted not merely as disagreement, but as disloyalty. Social media intensification, online discourse rewards purity tests, outrage, and identity policing. Nuanced positions often get flattened into binaries, for us or against us. Gendered perception differences. As you pointed out, some behaviors may be interpreted differently depending on whether they come from black men or black women. There are separate historical expectations projected onto both groups, and people often react emotionally to perceived shifts in gender roles, economic power, or dating dynamics. Class and mobility tensions. When black individuals gain economic success, move geographically, adopt different politics, or enter spaces traditionally associated with wealth or conservatism, some people interpret it as distancing from the community rather than simple personal evolution. The difference between representation and ownership. Sometimes people want successful black individuals to remain symbolically tied to the group, but not necessarily free to define themselves outside collective expectations. That creates friction between being representative and being fully autonomous. At the same time, it's important to recognize that the black community is not monolithic. There are millions of black people with radically different views on economics, religion, politics, gender roles, gun ownership, relationships, and identity. Often, the loudest voices online create the illusion of consensus when there really isn't one. My broader observation is that the more rigid the social expectations around identity become, the more some people will choose distance over participation, not because they reject the group itself, but because they reject conditional belonging. Killer Mike is the perfect example of how complicated black identity becomes once somebody stops fitting neatly into one ideological box. Killer Mike has historically spoken about black empowerment, community economics, police brutality, financial literacy, entrepreneurship, black-owned banks, gun ownership, local politics, and self-determination. But because he's pro-capitalism in some respects, pro-2A, willing to engage with people across ideological lines, and doesn't always repeat the expected political script, he regularly gets accused of contradiction, hypocrisy, or selling out. There's an increasing expectation that black people, especially visible black men, must align with a very specific ideological framework to remain socially safe within certain spaces. The issue with statements like black men are the problem or black men are a cancer to the community is that they stop being a critique and start becoming collective condemnation. There's a difference between criticizing behaviors, systems, or trends versus framing an entire demographic as fundamentally harmful. Once conversations move into broad moral indictments of black men as a class, it creates resentment, defensiveness, and eventually disengagement. Ironically, this undermines the exact collective unity people claim to want. If a black man feels his politics are policed, his masculinity is pathologized, his economic choices are morally scrutinized, his relationships are monitored, and his individuality is treated as betrayal, then eventually he's going to say, "Why am I fighting to stay inside a space that constantly tells me I'm the problem?" That doesn't mean every criticism of black men is invalid. There are real conversations to be had about accountability, gender dynamics, family structure, violence, emotional maturity, economics, and leadership. But collective blame language usually destroys nuance. It flattens millions of people into one moral category. And I think social media has made this much worse because outrage-based discourse rewards absolutes. What I've been noticing is that the biggest threat to the current political establishment, especially the Democratic establishment, isn't necessarily the openly black Republican. It's the politically independent black man. A black Republican is already viewed as outside the mainstream black political consensus, so people already know how to categorize and dismiss him. But the independent black man is harder to control, harder to predict, and harder to shame into ideological conformity. He might support certain progressive ideas while also believing in capitalism, entrepreneurship, gun rights, meritocracy, stricter immigration policies, or skepticism toward government dependency. He may reject both political parties entirely while still caring deeply about black people and systemic inequality. That ideological flexibility disrupts the expectation that black political identity must automatically align with one political framework. And what I keep noticing is that when black men publicly step outside those expectations, the backlash becomes deeply personal and emotional rather than simply political. It's not treated like ordinary disagreement, it's treated like betrayal. You can see this in the reactions surrounding people like Stephen A. Smith, Killer Mike, or even black people who work in law enforcement or agencies like ICE. Instead of engaging with their ideas directly, a lot of the discourse becomes about questioning their loyalty, authenticity, masculinity, or connection to blackness itself. I think certain media gatekeepers contribute to that environment. Figures like Roland Martin, Karen Hunter, and Tiffany Cross often frame political deviation from the dominant black political narrative as something dangerous or irresponsible. In some cases, the rhetoric becomes openly contemptuous. For example, Tiffany Cross, referring to Stephen A. Smith with phrases like "little dick energy," wasn't really a substantive political critique, it was ridicule aimed at diminishing him personally and symbolically. To me, that reflects how quickly disagreement can turn into public shaming when a black man refuses ideological alignment. That's part of the contradiction I keep seeing inside the broader conversation about the black community. We constantly talk about unity, solidarity, and collective progress, but at the same time, there seems to be decreasing tolerance for ideological diversity, especially from black men who refuse to operate inside socially approved lanes. The result is that more black men are choosing political independence or disengagement altogether, not necessarily because they reject the community, but because they no longer feel like there's room to think differently without being attacked, mocked, or treated as morally defective. And ironically, the more aggressively people try to police ideological boundaries, the more fragmentation they create. The result is that more black men are choosing political independence or disengagement altogether, not necessarily because they reject the community, but because they no longer feel like there's room to think differently without being attacked, mocked, or treated as morally defective. And ironically, the more aggressively people try to police ideological boundaries, the more fragmentation they create. Being about policy and starting to become about identity management. Instead of simply asking, why does this person believe what they believe, the reaction often becomes, how can you call yourself black and think like that? Who are you really aligned with? You're helping the opposition. You're confused. You're platforming harmful ideas. So even saying I'm independent can trigger resistance because it challenges the assumption that black political identity should function collectively rather than individually. And I think that's part of the larger fragmentation happening right now. A growing number of black men seem less interested in inherited political loyalty and more interested in evaluating issues individually: economics, masculinity, policing, entrepreneurship, immigration, education, gun rights, foreign policy, etc. But instead of that being treated as intellectual autonomy, it's often interpreted as ideological betrayal or disconnection from the community. That creates a situation where political independence itself becomes socially controversial in ways that it often isn't for other groups. Malcolm X's "The Ballot or the Bullet" actually fits into this conversation in a very interesting way because, in many respects, Malcolm was arguing for a form of black political independence long before the modern version of this debate existed. One of the central ideas in "The Ballot or the Bullet" was that black people should stop giving unconditional loyalty to political parties that take their votes for granted. Malcolm criticized both Republicans and Democrats, but he was especially critical of the Democratic Party because he believed many black Americans were emotionally attached to it despite limited material results. His argument was essentially, black people should use their political power strategically, not emotionally. That connects directly to the modern discussion about black male independence and individualism. Malcolm wasn't telling black people to become Republicans. He was telling them to stop behaving like politically owned people. He believed black voters should be independent enough to negotiate, withhold support, demand accountability, and prioritize their own interests instead of automatically aligning with any party out of tradition or identity. That's why his speech still resonates today. A lot of politically independent black men are expressing a similar frustration. Why is independent thought treated like betrayal? Why is political loyalty expected without negotiation? Why are black voters assumed to belong to one party by default? Why does disagreement become a question of racial authenticity? In many ways, Malcolm's framework was anti-tribal. He emphasized self-determination, political maturity, self-respect, and strategic thinking over blind allegiance. He wanted black people to think critically and act in their own interests, not simply inherit political identities. And importantly, Malcolm also tied politics to masculinity, dignity, and autonomy. He often spoke against dependency, humiliation, and paternalism. That's part of why modern discussions about black male political independence sometimes echo his rhetoric, especially when people discuss feeling politically managed, morally policed, or expected to fall in line. At the same time, Malcolm also strongly believed in collective black consciousness and collective struggle. So he wasn't advocating hyper-individualism in the modern every man for himself sense. His vision was more about collective empowerment without political captivity, solidarity without blind obedience, and racial unity without surrendering independent thought. That's probably the most important connection to your broader conclusion. The modern tension isn't necessarily that black men are rejecting the community altogether. It's that many are rejecting the idea that solidarity should require ideological submission. And Malcolm X's message in "The Ballot or the Bullet" arguably supports the notion that political independence, strategic voting, and skepticism toward party loyalty are not betrayals of black interests. They are part of political self-determination itself. The overall conclusion is that a growing number of black men appear to be shifting away from identity-based political loyalty and toward a more individualized approach to politics, economics, culture, and personal values. And the tension surrounding that shift reveals a larger conflict between collective expectations and personal autonomy within modern black political discourse. At the center of this conversation is the idea that Black men are increasingly questioning whether racial solidarity should require ideological conformity. Many still care deeply about Black people, Black progress, and systemic inequality, but they no longer automatically accept the idea that there is only one acceptable political framework, cultural posture, or worldview attached to Black identity. What makes this shift significant is that Black political alignment has historically been treated not just as a strategy but as a moral obligation. So when Black men publicly embrace independence, whether politically, economically, culturally, or socially, it often triggers backlash because it disrupts long-standing assumptions about group cohesion and predictability. The deeper issue isn't simply conservatism versus liberalism. It's autonomy versus expectation. A politically independent Black man represents someone who wants the freedom to evaluate policies individually instead of tribally, prioritize personal principles over party loyalty, define masculinity for himself, pursue capitalism or entrepreneurship without guilt, hold nuanced or mixed political views, and exist as an individual without having his Blackness constantly measured against ideological standards. And the more rigid those standards become, the more some Black men feel pushed toward individualism, disengagement, or alternative spaces where they feel less politically managed and more intellectually free. At the same time, this trend also exposes a broader truth: the Black community has never been truly monolithic. There have always been ideological divisions around religion, class, gender roles, economics, nationalism, integration, capitalism, self-defense, and political strategy. Social media and modern political polarization have made those fractures more visible and emotionally charged. Ultimately, the conclusion isn't that Black collective identity is disappearing. It's that many Black men are redefining what participation in the community looks like. They are increasingly rejecting the idea that racial authenticity must be tied to automatic political obedience or social conformity. And unless there is more space for ideological diversity, disagreement, and individuality within Black discourse, the fragmentation will likely continue, not because Black men necessarily want separation from the community, but because many no longer want belonging to come at the cost of independent thought. How do I change your voice to a Black male?